everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. We join you today from the North Central Research Station at Lahoma for the biggest wheat field day of the year. Producers from around the wheat belt are arriving and ready for the latest information. And we'll begin today with a discussion on varieties and research.
One of the great things about coming to Lahoma is learning about wheat varieties. And David, let's talk about some of the varieties that have been released over the past 5 years or so. How are they faring across the state?
Well, this year they're having an okay year. It kind of depends on where you're at, if we were able to catch some of the rains. But I think a lot of it is going to come back to some of the disease pressure that we had some of those areas. So some of the varieties that you kind of mentioned there would be like a Gallagher, an Iba, Double Stop, Bentley, Stardust. Those varieties out of the Oklahoma State program. And if you're able to catch a little bit of rain at the right time, if you're fortunate enough to get that, I think we're going to have pretty good yield potential out there in a number of areas. It's going to come back to a little bit about some of that disease pressure, especially leaf rust. This year, that was more prevalent than stripe rust. We did see a little bit of stripe rust in numerous areas across the state. It was just one that never got up and going, but leaf rust certainly has. So if a producer had that pathogen around and was able to protect that flag leaf, I still think you were going to be able to protect a lot of that yield potential that some of these varieties offer.
And more than anything, you're a scientist and you collect the data from across the state, and at the end of the season you'll compile all that data and then put it out as a report, right?
You bet. So we do the best we can to try and control everything that we possibly can on our end, and our whole goal is to try and reduce as much variability in these plots as possible. If we can do that, then we can start picking out with more confidence differences between these varieties. So we'll take as many notes as we can, try to make some adjustments. Maybe we have a bad plot, we can get rid of that and use some statistics to again help represent the variety as best as we can. And then when we put those reports out, we try to include any notes that we possibly can, such as this year, Lahoma, we have rust that came in later in the growing, later in the season. So when people look at that variety, those results, and they see maybe a variety that they really like and it's maybe more middle of the pack, well, maybe that could be because it's a variety that's more susceptible to rust. So you maybe want to look at the fungicide. How did it respond when it came to a fungicide? Maybe it's now more towards the top. So try to give people as much information as we can to help them make those decisions moving forward in terms of variety selection. And then we try to post that data as soon as possible. As far as I'm aware of, I know Dr. Edwards started this several years ago. This is the fastest turnaround maybe anywhere in the country, at least that I'm aware of. So within a day, maybe just a couple days after we harvest, we're going to have that data already posted up for people to view, and we'll put it out first on our website, wheat.okstate.edu. And then when we get all of the data finally compiled, we'll go ahead and print our report out and try to distribute that to as many stakeholders as we can.
Okay, thank you much, David Marburger. And for more information on that website, go to our website, sunup.okstate.edu.
We're here with Brett Carver now, who leads our wheat improvement team. And Brett, we're here in your research area. Let's talk about some of the things you're visiting with producers about.
Yes, today we're talking about some of the more advanced lines in our program that have made it to the point where we can test them in cooperation with commercial bakers. We have two classes of wheat represented in this lineup. 16 are hardwood winter and 4 are hard white. Of the 16 hardwood winners, we have 2 that now have approval from the Oklahoma Agriculture Experiment Station to be released and the seed produced to be distributed to seed producers. And those 2 we really ought to say some things about, because I think producers really need to know about them. There's going to be plenty of seed available this summer if everything goes okay from this point forward. So far, so good. But before we talk about the new releases, maybe we ought to talk about where we have been. Because this has had an influence at least on one of those releases, and that's Gallagher. Gallagher is certainly one of the most popular varieties in the state. It leads the state according to the NASS survey, so we know there's a lot of acres out there. We know that that's a genetic background that is acceptable to our wheat producers and to our millers and bakers. So it'll be a great genetic background to build upon, to go to the next variety. And certainly we did that with an experimental line that we had numbered 11D25056. We actually started testing that line in 2011. That's the reason for the 11. The D is because it's a double haploid, which circumvents some of the conventional breeding process. We can generate an inbred line much quicker that way. We also missed some opportunities for selection, which can be a negative, but the big positive is we can turn around a variety much quicker. Instead of waiting about 10 years for a descendant from Gallagher to hit seed producers in the market out there, we now have gone basically Gallagher was released in 2012, I believe, and here it is 2017. We already have ample seed to go out to the market of Gallagher's descendant. So we cut that time in half, basically.
So that's definitely exciting, that much faster to advance the science. Smith's Gold is one of the newest varieties just released. Tell us how it is related to Gallagher and these other experimental lines.
Smith's Gold is directly related to Gallagher. Gallagher constitutes 1/2 of the parentage of Smith's Gold. The other involves an experimental line from OSU that it itself involves familiar genetics to our wheat producers, one of which is 2174, an older variety from the 1990s, and then TAM 110. It was the TAM 110 source that we were able to take green bug resistance from and combine it with the Hessian fly resistance from 2174 and package it in a Gallagher background. And that was the primary motivation for producing Smith's Gold. Out of that process, we increased yield potential, and you can see it to some extent in the size of the heads compared to Gallagher. I think head number would be about the same as Gallagher, but the size of the head will be bigger. And that's where I think we're getting that yield advantage. But in addition to that, Gallagher has provided some really good stripe rust resistance. Stripe rust is a ravaging disease. It was in 2015 and 2016, not so much in 17. That's okay, it'll come back, believe me. And when it does, we think we have a better variety to handle that. In fact, we have done enough testing outside of Oklahoma to know that this variety does very well against other stripe rust races that are present in our country right now. So we have pretty good confidence for this being a stripe rust resistant variety.
Okay, next we have 10126.
This variety is quite different from the Gallagher background. We're going to have to talk about a totally different genetic background with this experimental line. And think about Jagger. Jagger was very popular in Oklahoma, certainly in Kansas where it originated. Jagger was one of the parents that produced one of our wheat varieties called OK Bullet. And OK Bullet has been used in our program profusely. I mean, it is spread throughout our program. One of the descendants of OK Bullet is this experimental line, 10126. We've had this in the program now under test for quite a bit of time, since 2010. And where we have noticed it doing best is under higher yield conditions, best yield conditions in north central Oklahoma and out in the panhandle. So under irrigation, this has a very high yield ceiling. A yield ceiling though high yield ceiling doesn't do much good unless you have good straw strength. And so that was a characteristic that we really tried hard to achieve. A lot of our germplasm, but it really comes true in this one. So 10126, being a descendant of Bullet, we thought what a perfect name would be is Spirit Rider, because they are truly linked to the saddle. They are closely related, and
then that OSU tradition.
Exactly. This is definitely an OSU tradition being continued.
And you have seed available, like you mentioned, for producers when they start making those decisions in the summer and early fall.
Right, and it's hard to say exactly what amount of seed will be available, but if things go right, it looks like about 10,000 bushels or more of Smith's Gold will be available, and about 5,000 bushels of Spirit Rider, and that's foundation seed.
Terrific. Okay, Brett, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This week was a tragic one as storms caused death, injuries, destroyed homes, and crop losses. The quick response from first responders prevented worse tragedy. Aid organizations moved rapidly to ease the pain and speed recovery. We are so thankful for the great effort of everyone involved. Another less obvious weather risk peaked around the corner this week, the risk from high summer heat. Tuesday, air temperatures climbed into the 80s. Beaver hit 88 degrees. When those temperatures were combined with high humidity and lower wind speeds, the wet bulb globe temperature was pushed into a low-risk category around Buffalo and southeast Oklahoma. It's a sign that summer's heat is creeping closer and closer. For cattle, the Mesonet Cattle Comfort Advisor on Tuesday afternoon climbed into the heat caution arena. Buffalo hit the 101 on the Cattle Comfort Index. Broken Bow hit 99. Proper hydration is one of the first concerns when heat risk goes up. Our mild temperatures and high humidities are increasing the number of days of high plant disease risk. For grapes, many Mesonet sites in central Oklahoma have already seen 20 or more days of grape black rot risk. Idabel and Broken Bow have had over 40 days of increased risk. That's 40 days out of 60 since the beginning of the spring growing season for grapes. Here's Gary with a drought update and a look ahead.
Thanks, Alan. Good morning, everyone. Now, I keep promising a drought-free map, and I'm sure we're eventually going to get there, especially if we keep seeing rainfall like we've seen over the last couple of weeks. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. Let's take a look at the latest U.S. Drought Monitor Map and see what we have. Drought is still centered down across south central Oklahoma from Carter County and then up through Atoka, Pushmataha, that area. This drought could definitely change next week. You look at the percentage of normal rainfall for the last 30 days, however, what this drought map is based upon, and we see again down across south central Oklahoma, some of those areas, especially in northern Carter County, are probably less than 25% of normal, judging by those colors, and that's not good for this time of year. So that's the reason why the drought was there on this week's drought map. With harvest just starting, I know many of you are worried about getting that equipment out into the fields, especially across southern Oklahoma. So let's take a look at next week. The 6 to 10 day outlook, probability of below normal temperatures across the central part of the United States, including all of Oklahoma, and also increased odds of above normal precipitation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a washout for next week, but it does mean a possible big storm system again next week, at least between May 22nd and May 26th. Hopefully that won't deter getting that equipment out in the field. But it's something we're going to have to watch. So we're looking at a double-edged sword here. We want rain to get rid of that drought, but we don't want the rain to start wheat harvest. Mother Nature's going to do what she's going to do anyway. Let's hope everything works out for the best, and we have a drought-free map next week, and wheat harvest is underway. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
Kim Anderson was also at Lahoma. Kim, producers talking about these low prices, and hopefully there's some hope in sight?
I think there's some hope in sight. If we have a good quality crop, I think we may see slightly higher prices as we get into harvest and on into the fall. You look right now, the market's offering anywhere from $3.30 to $3.50 for wheat. That basis is a minus 95 cents to a minus 75, and the loan rate's at 2.97. So yeah, I think we could see higher prices if we have quality in this crop.
The U.S. has sold some hard red winter wheat to Egypt. Is that good news?
That's very good news. It's been a while since we've sold wheat into Egypt, and our price was the lowest price, and so that means we're competitive on the world market. You look at the prices. We had two different contracts with them, 60,000 metric ton or 2.1 million bushels each contract, $5.08 and $5.05 at the port. The freight to Egypt was 56 cents and 61 cents a bushel, so a total on board at Egypt is $5.64 and $5.66. Romania sold wheat for $5.37 with 26 cents transportation, $5.64. Russia sold 60,000 metric ton, about 2.2 million bushels at $5.39. at 29 cents freight for 567, and Ukraine sold 60,000 or 2.2 million at $5.36, 32 cents freight for 568. We had the lowest price wheat in those contracts, and that's good news selling wheat to Egypt.
What's the market offering for canola?
You look at canola, it's $6.75. That's an excellent price when you compare it to wheat. Yeah, could we use a little higher canola price? You bet. But when you compare it to $3.50 for wheat, I think our producers will take it.
Not so bad. And then summer crops, we're keeping an eye on those. What do you have for corn, sorghum, and beans?
Well, if you look at corn, the market's offering 60 cents under the Chicago December contract. That gets you 3 1/4 in most of Oklahoma, $3.65 in the Panhandle. Sorghum's 80 cents whether you're in the Panhandle or anywhere around, and that gets you $3.05 a bushel for sorghum, harvest delivered. And soybeans is a minus 75 cents off that November contract that gets you about $8.75.
Okay, Kim, thanks a lot. We'll see you next week. Looking at some sorghum research with Josh Lofton, our Extension Cropping System Specialist. Josh, tell us about your research, what's set up here, and what you're looking at.
All right, so what we're looking at here is sugarcane aphids have been the primary thing that sorghum growers in the state have been concerned about, worried about, and having to manage over the last couple years. The biggest thing is one of the best decisions on how to manage sugarcane aphid is actually what hybrids you plant. And so that decision starts right now and during planting. And so we have a lot of options for growers that can select various hybrids from various companies that have some degree of sugarcane aphid tolerance. However, a lot of those have been tested in the lab. And a lot of those tolerance have been tested in the lab. And sometimes those hybrids that have really good tolerance don't yield. We saw that last year. One of a very good hybrid that had a very good tolerance yielded 20 bushels. And so that's what we're doing out here. We're taking sorghum hybrids that have known sugarcane aphid tolerance that we are familiar with, some that have just been released, and some that have a susceptibility, and we're actually looking at how well they yield in the field and what growers could potentially expect whenever they look specifically at those sugarcane aphid tolerant hybrids.
The great thing about Lahoma is that you do get some face time with the growers from around this area. They're asking you questions about replanting sorghum because of the recent weather events a few weeks ago. Talk about that.
Yeah, so because we had that warm spring, everybody wanted to get out and do something, and a lot of folks did. And so we have a lot of folks that have planted and it stayed in the ground for very long, and that cool snaps really made it to where it's not doing very well. The other unfortunate thing is we had a lot of folks that planted that caught these hailstorms that we've had the last couple of days. And so with those hailstorms and those cool weather, we have very spotty fields, very thin fields. And so a lot of growers are asking, do I replant or just keep what I have? And that's a very challenging thing to answer because it depends on so many things. The biggest thing that we're telling guys is if you have 20,000 plants out in the field and you have a good stand and it's nice and even, to keep it. I mean, that's a guaranteed plant that you have out there. If we plant now, one, we don't know if it's going to come up, and two, we're already in conditions that we're going to be maturing in middle to late July, and that's where we like to avoid. We don't typically get a whole lot of rain in July. It's usually 100 degrees in July, and it doesn't cool down much at night, and so that's what we like to avoid. So guys that have sorghum in the field, have 20,000 plants, and it looks really good, we're telling them to keep it because that's probably the best option for them.
And then in terms of scouting, what should folks keep in mind?
Yeah, it's never too early to start thinking about sugarcane aphids. Right now they're in far South Texas. But when we start getting into that July time frame and it's starting to look for sugarcane aphids out in your field, what we're telling growers is if you have sugarcane aphid population that's that big per leaf, that's our threshold. A lot of folks want to wait until they see these big colonies of sugarcane aphids, and by that point in time, you're in the thousands. Our critical threshold is about 100 sugarcane aphids per leaf blade on average across the field. And that's about what we're looking at, about the size of a dime on the sorghum leaf blades. So if you go around the field, the best scouting method is to pick about 5 places throughout your field. get about 5 plants in one of those places. And what we like to see is the lowest green leaf and the tallest green leaf, or the highest green leaf, youngest one, if you want to say that, and look at those two. So we get on average about 40 or 50 plants around the field. Count your aphids or estimate them, give a good number, and that's your average aphids per leaf. If you're over 100, go ahead and pull that trigger on your application.
Okay, terrific. We'll see you again soon, Josh. Thanks a
you.
lot.
Doesn't it just seem like the calving season for 2017 was just over? But I'm going to tell you that I think it's time to really get started planning for the calving season of 2018. Why would I say that? Well, I think this is a good time to look back in our calving book and see what problems we had in this last calving season and what we can do to help prevent those problems in the future. For instance, if you look back in your calving book and you see that the primary source of any death loss took place right at calving time, right as the calves were delivered, and especially if you notice that primarily the loss was in 2-year-old heifers when they had their calves. Well, that tells me then that we probably want to reevaluate our heifer growing program for this next year. And it may be a little late for this one, but for our future calf crops, let's rethink our sire selection that we're breeding those heifers to and work a little harder towards getting calving ease sires, low birth weight sires that we breed to those heifers, and see if we can alleviate some of those problems. Now, did some of our calf loss take place, say 1, 2, 3 weeks after the calves were born? And that usually points towards the disease calf diarrhea or calf scours. Do we calve in the same pasture, in the same lot, year after year after year? Well, perhaps if we're having a lot of calf scour problems in our herd, we want to change that pattern. Also, I think that this calf diarrhea situation also could point us towards that heifer development program once again, because we know that calves born to thin heifers are a little more likely to have some calving difficulty, and that thin heifer isn't giving as much colostrum, that first milk, that calf needs for disease protection. Certainly, if you have a high incidence of calf diarrhea in your herd this particular spring, visit with your local veterinarian, because one of the things that they may recommend is a pre-calving vaccination for the cows. And one last concept that I think is important to at least consider, and that is during the calving season, can you get the older calves and their mothers away from the area where the newborns are going to arrive? And that way then you can perhaps break the cycle of moving those particular pathogens from the older calves to those newborns. Go to the SUNUP website, sunup.okstate.edu. We'll give you a link there to a chance for you to read more about the Nebraska Sandhill calving system. Hey, we hope that helps you in next year's calving season, and we sure look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
Daryl Peel, our livestock marketing specialist, is here now. And Daryl, beef exports have been going strong this year. What does the March trade data show you?
Beef exports were strong again in March, up over 25%, and that means for the whole first quarter of the year we were up about 22%. So we continued very strong. All of our major markets were up, the top 5 markets with the exception of Hong Kong, which is down a little bit year over year.
Can you give us an idea of how important the exports are, or how that works in terms of total demand?
Exports allow us to sell those products into other markets that don't have as good a demand here, which frees up demand in the U.S. So it actually stimulates domestic demand when we export those lower valued products.
Let's talk about imports now. How does that play in?
You know, imports were down slightly in March, not down as much as they had been for the so far this year. For the first quarter of the year, we're down about 12%. And again, most of the major sources were down: Australia, New Zealand, Canada were down. Mexico was up, as was Brazil and Nicaragua, which are smaller markets for U.S. beef imports.
I've heard people say, why do we import beef into the United States? I'm sure you get this question. Don't we have enough beef here already?
Well, it's more than just a question of total pounds, and I think that's what people overlook. Again, beef is a lot of different products. And in particular, because of the unique role of the ground beef market, the hamburger market in the U.S. is so strong, we don't produce enough of those lean trimmings that we need to make ground beef out of. And so without the imports, we would actually have less value for that part of our animals in the U.S. So imports actually add value to U.S. cattle.
We also get cattle from Mexico and Canada. Where are we in terms of trade?
Well, again, for the year for the month of March, cattle imports were down, both from Mexico and Canada. For the year to date, we're still up about a little bit less than 6% for the year. Canada's cattle exports to the U.S. have been down not only last year, but so far this year. Mexico was up pretty sharply in January and February. That's a continuation from last fall. November and December were up year over year. But in March, they were about the same as a year ago, and there are indications in the preliminary April data that the Mexican imports will be dropping off a little bit. So probably we'll see that tail off a little bit as we go forward this year.
Okay, well, stay tuned. Thanks a lot, Daryl. That'll do it for us this week. Remember, you can find us anytime on our website and also follow us on YouTube and social media. From the North Central Research Station at Lahoma, where the wheat is always waving, I'm Lyndall Stout, and we'll see you next time at SUNUP.